The sculptor stood before what was to become his next commission. Other sculptors had attempted to turn the stone into a piece of art, but had failed. He could see the marks left by their chisels, and shook his head in disbelief. How had the ruling powers come to believe anyone other than himself could have turned this block of stone into anything of substance? He spent the entire day pacing around the block, knowing that tonight would be the beginning of his labors. He was unsure if he would finish the piece on time, for what he was about to begin had not been attempted since the days of ancient Rome. But the sculptor didn't care. Inside this block was an image of the greatest king Israel had ever known, and he would set him free no matter how long it took. He picked up his hammer and chisel, and, in the light of the full moon, made the first strikes on the 18-foot block of white Carrara marble. Virtuous Men, a podcast devoted to sharing the lives of men of history, fiction, and today, and the virtues they personify. Over the course of this season, we'll explore the lives of 5 men who each exemplified a crucial virtue of life with not just their words, but their actions. From these men, we hope you will learn that a life of virtue is something you can achieve, no matter the obstacle.
Welcome to Episode 3, The Ambition of Michelangelo, featuring special guest Ross King, art historian and author of such titles as Michelangelo and the Pope's Ceiling, The Bookseller of Florence, and Brunelleschi's Dome. Also featuring special guest Andrew Graham-Dixon, art critic, broadcaster, and author of such titles as A History of British Art, Michelangelo and the Sistine Chapel, and Caravaggio, A Life Sacred and Profane. A virtue is a behavior one conforms to in order to achieve a moral and ethically principled life through action. A virtuous man is one who is well aware of how he falls short, yet chooses not to allow his flaws to define him as he seeks to better himself. Such men show that it is possible to overcome the things that keep us from achieving our destinies. Though each man is flawed and imperfect, it is in the lives of flawed men that we see the possibility for virtue in our own lives. This episode's virtue is ambition. Ambition is defined as having a goal and making whatever sacrifices are necessary to achieve it. The goal is often something that is difficult to obtain, whether it be for personal growth, bettering the lives of others, or to rise above the status quo. A person who seeks such lofty goals in life is called ambitious. To such people, mediocrity is the greatest threat. While there are many examples of how ambition can be used to commit evil, it is, in and of itself, something every man should strive for in his life. One of art history's most towering examples of ambition is Michelangelo. In this episode, we will explore not only how nearly every piece of art he created is defined by ambition, but how his ambition made the world a more beautiful place.
The day was March 6th, 1475, in the town of Caprese. It was foretold in the horoscopes that a person born on such a day would be gifted in the arts that delight the senses, such as painting and sculpture. A son was born to Lodovico Buonarroti, and he was named Michelangelo. He would have 4 brothers in all, the eldest, Leonardo, and his 3 younger siblings, Buonarrota, Giovansimone, and Sigismondo. Despite being born into an upper-middle-class family, they were not as well off as they had once been. Historian and author Ross King.
Michelangelo was born in 1475 into what had once upon a time been quite an affluent, important family. Members of the Buonarroti family had served as politicians in Florence, and you didn't get to serve as one of the priori, as they were called, one of the, I guess you would think of him as a local town councilor or something like that, unless you came from a certain social standing. And certainly the Buonarroti had enjoyed that, enjoyed it for decades, if not centuries, But recently, in the last generation or two, the family had come down a little bit in standing and also in economic status. Michelangelo's father, whose name is Lodovico, still enjoyed a kind of political career of sorts, insofar as he did serve as the local magistrate, as the chief magistrate in this small town of where Michelangelo was born, just outside of Florence. And so the Buonarroti still had a bit of an aura to them of a great family. And certainly Lodovico Buonarroti believed in this grand genealogy of the family, but he wasn't really holding up his end as far as his ancestors, I think, would have been concerned.
Though he would tragically lose his mother at the age of 6, his father made sure his son would be taken care of in his developing years. Michelangelo would receive a good education from teachers located in the illustrious learning center of Urbino. Most importantly, he grew up around the stonemasons and marble cutters in the countryside, thus becoming fascinated and familiar with the tools of his eventual profession. When his family moved to the city of Florence, the environment was just as enriching as the country. Artistic wonders seemed to appear around every corner. In a single day, he could see the doors of the baptistry by Lorenzo Ghiberti, the legendary dome of Santa Maria del Fiore by Filippo Brunelleschi, and paintings by Andrea Verrocchio, who had once been the master of his older contemporary, Leonardo da Vinci. From sculptures, to paintings, to buildings, the young man was in no better environment for artistic development. On the cusp of his teenage years, Michelangelo told his father that he wanted to pursue a career as a painter.
Lodovico Buonarroti was not so happy with young Michelangelo's career choice, and according to one of Michelangelo's biographers, Lodovico Buonarroti and his brothers, i.e. Michelangelo's uncles, would beat him to try to get this idea of becoming a painter out of his head. Because, of course, the Buonarroti are these important people in Florence, and they do not want someone who works with his hands. Lodovico Buonarroti appears not to have done very much work at all, but he certainly was not going to work with his hands. And of course, in the 1480s, that's how painters were viewed. They were people who worked to order. They painted banners for pageants and saints' days and things like that. They decorated signs. They did outdoor painting, things like that. And so Lodovico Buonarroti was not going to stand for his son going into that kind of business.
Despite his father's misgivings, he nonetheless saw to it that he was given an apprenticeship. By 13, he was working as an errand boy in the workshop of one of the 15th century's greatest frescoists, Domenico Ghirlandaio. Michelangelo was fortunate to be apprenticing under such a prominent and well-connected artist. Ghirlandaio was extremely passionate about his craft. Years earlier, he had led a group of master artists, among them Sandro Botticelli and Pietro Perugino, to paint the walls of the recently constructed Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo would learn some of the foundational artistic skills from his master, such as draftsmanship, how to paint in fresco and panel, and how to use colors and pigments properly. He also sketched and made copies of early Renaissance masters, such as Giotto and Masaccio. But arguably his greatest learning experience came from an opportunity to study in the sculpture garden of Lorenzo de' Medici, the powerful ruler of Florence. Author and historian Andrew Graham-Dixon.
He studied sculpture in a workshop run by a man called Bertoldo di Giovanni, which was in a sculpture garden owned by Lorenzo the Magnificent. And Bertoldo was himself a pupil of Donatello. So Michelangelo would have absorbed almost from the origin the entire tradition of Florentine sculpture.
As he studied the works of past and present masters, Michelangelo began to reveal his own obvious talent. His oldest known work, a 33 by 35 inch marble relief known as the Battle of the Centaurs, shows a group of muscular nude men struggling with a group of centaurs. Remarkably, he was already able to create a work with multiple figures filled with emotion and movement at only age 13. Another smaller piece he completed soon after was another relief known as the Madonna of the Stairs. It shows Mary and Jesus on a seat with a staircase receding into the background with other figures standing in the correct visual perspective. The piece showcases two facets of Michelangelo's working method that would carry throughout his life: his ambition and his overwhelming desire to be better than all others who had come before him.
It's a very beautiful piece where we have a Madonna holding the child, and there's a receding stairway in the background. So he's using perspective, and as he carves the stairs, each one has to just recede that much more than the other one. I think even carving this in Play-Doh would be difficult for us today. And it was a very ambitious piece of work in its own right. But what makes it even more ambitious and even more telling is the fact that he was taking on Donatello. Donatello had died 9 years before he was born, but he was the greatest sculptor pre-Michelangelo of the 1400s. He had a colossal reputation. You could see his work not just all over Florence, but you could see it in Padua, you could see it in Siena, you could see it in various places in Italy. He had a European reputation. And now you have this 14-year-old kid who comes into this Medici sculpture garden and starts doing Donatello-style work. And so he's clearly patterning himself on the best. He's almost learning to run before he can walk, but you know, he is staying on his feet, and it's a remarkable work of art.
Lorenzo the Magnificent passed away in 1492, leaving the rising young artist in need to find work elsewhere. He did not have to wait long. Over the next few years, he received commissions from prominent families and individuals, even supposedly making a snowman for one of the Medici. The political turmoil was rising in the 1490s, reaching a height when the Medici were driven from power. This left Michelangelo having to work for rival families, patrons, and political classes, something that would last for much of his long career. His travels took him to Rome, where, in 1496 to 1497, he was commissioned by a wealthy cardinal to carve a sculpture of Bacchus, the Roman god of wine. In addition to looking less like a modern work and more like a piece from ancient antiquity, it was unusually large for sculptures of his time, as if to predate the large works of art to come. Michelangelo briefly returned to painting before he received another sculpture commission. It was to be a life-size sculpture of a familiar subject in art, Mary holding the body of her dead son Jesus, a scene commonly known as the Pietà, or the Pity.
It was commissioned by a French cardinal called Jean de Bière, who took a chance on this young artist, and in a way won, because the sculpture was made by Michelangelo for the cardinal's funeral monument, but in a way the cardinal also lost, because it then became so astonishingly famous and celebrated a work that it was actually moved to a different place, more prominent, within St. Peter's, so that it could be admired.
Michelangelo had recently had some bad experiences with the marble he had been using. Much of the stone was shot through with metallic veins, or far too shallow to be usable. Eventually, Michelangelo chose to only work with pieces of marble he selected himself. This took him to the quarries of Carrara, which were famous for the purity and lush white color of its marble. He finally found a suitable block and had it shipped back to Rome. The contract for the work was written in August of 1497 and stated that, quote, Michelangelo will complete the work in 1 year, and will be the most beautiful marble sculpture to be found in Rome today, and that no master today could do it better. He spent the next year carving the work, polishing the surface to a smooth, clean shine in a meticulous way he would never attempt again. When the sculpture was unveiled in 1499, the 24-year-old sculptor proved just how thoroughly he had lived up to the lofty responsibility laid down in the contract. From that point on, he was viewed as the leading sculptor of his age, and officially recognized as an artistic genius without equal. When his close friend and biographer Giorgio Vasari observed the body of Christ, he wrote, "It would be impossible to find a body showing greater mastery of art." With this one sculpture, Michelangelo managed to surpass the ancients, the standard by which all art was judged, and usher in a new era of art. The Pietà is widely seen as Michelangelo's first true masterpiece, and remains one of the most revered sculptures in history.
I think it's the pathos of it that's so extraordinary. What's beautiful about it, or one of the many things that's beautiful about it, is this sense that in death, Christ lies on his mother's lap naked but for the loincloth that he wore during his crucifixion. So he is restored, so to speak, to the condition of the child that we so often see bouncing on her knee in, Madonna and child imagery of the Renaissance. So anybody from the time would have thought, gosh, it's the Madonna and child. Oh, but it's not the child, it's the man, and he's dead. So it's that intense conjuring up of what a mother must feel when her son is dead and she's cradling him, not because he's a helpless baby, but because he's a corpse beyond help. And I think that's at the heart of it. That's at the heart of it. His form seems almost as if it's still alive. It's as if the body has only just stopped pumping the blood, as if the heart has only just stopped. And he's clearly not in rigor mortis. His body is a dead weight. It's all floppy. Where she's cradling him under his arm, and you can feel and see every vein, every joint, every bone, every tendon. It's just extraordinary that a man of 23 years of age could have created such a thing out of marble.
After the Pietà was complete, Michelangelo's talents were in high demand. He was able to secure an enormous commission to produce 15 sculptures for the altarpiece of Siena Cathedral, though he would only produce 4. In 1501, another commission had come his way. For decades, a giant block of Carrara marble had been in the possession of the Florentine Republic. They had wanted someone to carve a giant sculpture of the biblical hero David to adorn one of the buttresses of Florence Cathedral. They were well aware of how difficult the project was going to be, but the symbolic and political power of the piece was too valuable for the city to cancel the commission.
Florence was a republic, unlike most of the other city-states of Italy at the time, with the exception of Venice, which didn't even consider itself to be part of Italy. Most of the other city-states were despotisms or tyrannies and wielded a lot of muscle. So Florence saw itself as an exception in being a republic, and it also saw itself as an exception in being an underdog. So the patron saints of Florence tended to be biblical heroes or heroines who were themselves underdogs who had fought against great odds to save their people from evil and deliver their people to God. So, for example, David, who had slain the mighty giant Goliath with no more than a slingshot, he was also a model for this Republican underdog Florence. The paradox in the case of this particular sculpture is that the stone from which it was to be carved was enormous. It was always going to be a huge sculpture. So the man who'd killed a giant was to be portrayed as a giant.
It was a project that spoke uniquely to an ambitious artist looking to best the competition and set himself a challenge. What made the commission even more appealing was that 2 previous sculptors, one of them a protege of the legendary Donatello, had tried to carve the piece, but had ultimately been defeated by the sheer size of the block. Though other sculptors with far more experience than Michelangelo had campaigned for the commission, it was ultimately awarded to him. Though the task was overwhelming and seemingly impossible, it did not seem to be so for the young Florentine artist.
What we see happening over the course of the decades and over the course of a century or so in Italian art and architecture is the artist given an impossible task, a task at which he cannot possibly succeed. And everyone thinks that he's going to fail. And that, of course, is Brunelleschi in 1420. That is Leonardo da Vinci in 1494. I mean, you would not expect him to make a success of The Last Supper. And that is almost simultaneous with that. That is Michelangelo in 1497, in 1500, getting this block of marble, which has defeated at least 1 and possibly 2 previous sculptures. It's a gigantic block of marble. It's very appealing because of its size, but it's also flawed in some way. And so he has this impossible task of what can he do with it? Can he succeed at it?
He officially began work on September 13th, 1501. As he carved, he used a wax model and likely numerous sketches to guide him. Normally, wax models were made to be as large as the sculpture, but this was impossible for a sculpture 18 feet tall. As he worked, he imagined the figure within, thinking less about the size of his task and more how to best free the figure from his stony prison, and, of course, if he could do better than the ancients before him.
Michelangelo certainly was consciously attempting to compete with the artists of the ancient world who had created great monumental sculptures, such as the Colossus of Rhodes, one of the great seven wonders of the world. He had that kind of competition with the past in his mind.
The piece is also revealing in that it shows Michelangelo's incredible knowledge of human anatomy. He had shown this before in previous works, but never on such a grand scale as the David. Such a thorough knowledge of the body likely came from a common practice at the time, the dissection of corpses.
As Leonardo da Vinci was, he would have been highly interested in the possibilities of understanding the human body more by dissection. And it's very hard to believe that he didn't either actively dissect human bodies or witness the dissection of human bodies, because it's very hard to see how he could have carved certain things which require a knowledge of the internal workings of the body as well as its external appearance without such experiences.
As he continued to work, he not only had to correct the work done by the previous sculptors who had taken on the block, but had to think about how the massive piece would stand erect without falling. Much of the statue's weight is supported by the various joints in the arms and legs, and if the center of gravity was not right, the sculpture would fall and break into pieces. To solve this, Michelangelo ingeniously carved a tree stump behind David's right leg to support the extra weight. It is unlikely anyone, or at least very few people, ever saw him working on the piece, as Michelangelo had hung curtains in place to hide the work from view. He was, by nature, a solitary and rather melancholic figure who took little delight in being in the company of others, especially other talented artists. One of his friends mentioned that, in addition to his antisocial tendencies, he also had some disagreeable hygienic habits. He would often work late into the night and would go to bed still wearing his boots, rarely taking them off. Friend and biographer Giorgio Vasari left a thorough record of his working habits, which indicate that nothing mattered more to Michelangelo than his art. As a young man, he would be so intent on his work that he used to make do with a little bread and wine, and he was still doing the same when he grew old, until the time he painted The Last Judgment, when he used to take his refreshment in the evening after the day's work was finished, but always very frugally. Although he became rich, he lived like a poor man, and he rarely, if ever, invited his friends to eat at his table, nor would he ever accept gifts from anyone, because he feared that this would place him under some kind of permanent obligation. This sober way of life kept him very alert and in want of very little sleep, and very often, being unable to rest, he would get up at night and set to work with his chisel, wearing a hat made of thick paper with a candle burning over the middle of his head, so that he could see what he was doing and have his hands free. The David was finally completed in 1504. It was yet another artistic and technical tour de force. No other sculpture of King David had ever been done in the way Michelangelo had done it. In modern times and with modern tools, a sculpture like the David can be executed in less than a year with assistance and machinery. Michelangelo accomplished it single-handedly in 3 years using primarily 3 chisels and a wooden ladder and scaffold. Despite its instantaneous status as a masterpiece of Renaissance art, one of the first visitors to see the completed piece felt that it needed one slight alteration.
The story goes that the Gonfaloniere, I suppose one would in modern terms call the mayor of Florence at the time, was a man called Piero Soderini. He went to assess the sculpture on behalf of the city, and he had the audacity to say that he thought the nose was too big. I think he was just thinking that he had to say something. It's like when a Hollywood producer sees the first cut of a movie, even if it's perfect, he has to say something's wrong. What about that scene? Surely there's just something, you could do something with that. So Michelangelo, with great sang-froid, grabbed, without Soderini seeing it, he grabbed a handful of marble chips from the floor and climbed up his ladder and stood in front of the nose of his figure so that you couldn't see really what he was doing. Made a load of tapping noises with his chisel and hammer and let fall these marble chips so that they cascaded to the floor. We didn't touch the sculpture at all. He came down and said, "Is that better?" And Soderini said, "Oh, that's perfect. È perfetto."
The sculpture and its attention to detail so impressed its patrons that they could not imagine putting it up high in a place where it would not be seen very well. To remedy this, they formed a committee of some of the most revered artists of the age, including Botticelli, Filippo Lippi, Perugino, and Leonardo da Vinci, to offer opinions. It was decided that it would be placed at the entrance to the Palazzo Vecchio, where it would replace a sculpture that had already been installed earlier, a sculpture by none other than Donatello. Over the course of 5 days, the 6-ton sculpture was carefully moved into place. On one of these days, some youths began throwing stones at it, indicating its power as a political symbol of its age. Though the sculpture has seen its share of troubles over the centuries, like so much of Michelangelo's work, it still retains its power to inspire awe.
When you see that Colossus, because I think that's what strikes everyone about it, it's monumental in size, and yet has this elegance and grace to it. It is a giant. It is Il Gigante, as it was called in Florence at that time. Ironically, since it wasn't a giant, it was David. But it is so impressive because of this combination of grace and delicacy with almost superhuman power.
By this time, Michelangelo was receiving more commissions than he could possibly complete, something which did not seem to lower his ambitions. In a span of 4 years, he accepted commissions for 37 different works. One of these was a bronze statue, an art form Michelangelo had never before attempted. Only 4 of these commissions were seen to completion, while the others rarely saw development past the conceptual stage. One of the most unique of these commissions was an enormous mural that was to be painted on one of the walls of the council hall of the Piazza della Signoria. The intention of the decorative scheme was to showcase works of art that highlighted the Florentine Republic's greatest military successes. The adjacent wall that was to face Michelangelo's painting was given a year earlier, much to his chagrin, to none other than Florence's other celebrated son, Leonardo da Vinci. Despite their status as the 2 towering artistic figures of their age, they famously disliked each other. Michelangelo had once mocked Leonardo for not being able to finish his enormous bronze horse statue, while Leonardo compared sculptors to bakers covered in flour. Despite their misgivings toward each other, they nonetheless made their preparations for the giant works. The commission was unique for another reason. Though Michelangelo had initially been trained in painting by a master painter, he had not had much experience with painting, let alone something as massive as a wall mural. Leonardo had recently finished The Last Supper, but its experimental method was ultimately a failure. Both artists each made enormous preparatory drawings, known as cartoons, and exhibited them to the public. This caused a near-religious outpouring of awe and admiration for the paintings to come. Sadly, neither painting was ever finished beyond this stage. Leonardo began his work, and, in his typical fashion, abandoned it when his experimental method didn't work. Michelangelo was himself called away to other commissions before he could even begin. It was the only time the 2 artistic titans ever worked together, leaving us to wonder what might have been. In 1505, Michelangelo was summoned to Rome by the man who would become his greatest patron, Pope Julius II. He had been so impressed with the Pietà that he wanted Michelangelo to carve his burial tomb. The 31-year-old artist soon learned that Julius was no ordinary patron. He had within him the same grand ambitions in regards to everything, whether personal or political, and the tomb was no exception. Not since the days of the Roman emperors had a tomb project been so grand and enormous. It was to have 40 life-size statues adorning the freestanding mausoleum, which would measure 30 feet high and 50 feet wide. It would also stand inside St. Peter's Basilica and would guarantee steady work for the remainder of the artist's life. Michelangelo was extremely enthusiastic about the project and set right to work, beginning the process of quarrying and shipping the marble to Rome. However, it became clear that St. Peter's could not possibly hold such a huge monument, and the Pope, rather abruptly, decided to instead rebuild St. Peter's and put the tomb on hold. As if to pour salt in a wound, the marble was given to famed architect Donato Bramante, one of his artistic rivals. Michelangelo, who had already spent 8 months quarrying marble from Carrara and had moved into a workshop nearby, was so distraught and angered that he boldly fled Rome, claiming he would never return. Julius promptly summoned the artist back to Rome, though Michelangelo still refused. After much quarreling and deal-making, he eventually returned. Though he still had hopes of working on the tomb, Julius presented a new commission instead, frescoing the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel.
The Pope's men finally caught up with Michelangelo and prevailed upon him to think again and accept the Pope's apologies for cancelling the commission, and would he consider painting the ceiling of the central chapel of Christendom, the Sistine Chapel. And Michelangelo eventually, it wasn't an overnight decision, eventually said yes, he would. It was something that he did not want to do and that he felt had been forced upon him as compensation for not being allowed to do the commission that he really did have his heart set on. So he always felt that he was a sculptor, not a painter. And he regarded painting as an inferior medium compared to sculpture. So he's not only doing something he didn't want to do, but it's in the wrong medium.
The interesting thing about the Sistine Chapel commission is he could have assigned much of it to assistants, who he probably could have found in Rome, or he could have sent to Florence and got capable guys to come and work with him to do a kind of geometric pattern on the ceiling. Probably could have done it within a year and then moved on to another task. But, of course, having been given that task, he decides that he is going to do something with it. And rather than just do 12 figures, he does, I forget the count now, something like 334 human or humanoid figures on it. Which I think shows the scale of his ambition. If he was going to do it, he was going to do it like no one had ever done anything like this previously. And that, of course, is exactly what he produced when it was unveiled in 1512. No one had ever seen the like of it. It was far more ambitious than any fresco that had ever been painted previously.
Despite his lofty artistic reputation, Michelangelo was, on the surface, an unusual selection for the job. He always stressed in his letters that he was a sculptor, and he had hardly touched a paintbrush since his apprenticeship under Ghirlandaio. He even went so far as to declare that painting was not my profession. When he was presented with the Pope's proposed pictorial scheme, he rejected it, boldly calling it a poor thing. For once, Julius did not seem to protest. According to the artist, he was given permission to design the ceiling as he wished. As bold as his claim was, there remains good evidence that he was, in fact, not embellishing the truth in this case. He officially began work on the vault on May 10, 1508. The contract stated that he would be paid a total of 3,000 ducats, with 500 ducat installments to be made as the years went by. In today's gold prices, 3,000 ducats would total over $500,000. Michelangelo's design consisted of 9 episodes from the Bible's Book of Genesis. Framing the main panels would be Old Testament prophets, the ancestors of Christ, and Sibyls of ancient Greece. Work began slowly and with much trial and error. The first panel took over a month to complete, and once began sprouting mold due to improper application. These incidents only further exemplified Michelangelo's belief that he was the wrong man for the job. Despite a slow start, he eventually began to grow faster and more confident as the months passed. By the time he reached the famous creation of Adam scene, he was able to paint freehand on the plaster without using traced outlines of the figures. 2 prominent myths about the painting of the ceiling developed around this time, myths that still persist to this day. That Michelangelo painted the ceiling all alone without any assistance, and that he did so lying flat on his back.
We have the myth that Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel all on his own without anyone even to grind his pigments because of Michelangelo. He is the one who spread that story. There is he had a friend and biographer named Ascanio Condivi who really sat down with Michelangelo, and Michelangelo, I think, really dictated the biography to him. It's really Michelangelo's autobiography in some ways. And that's where we hear this story that he did it all by himself. But that simply could not be true. Logistically, It couldn't be true. And it also would have been stupid to try to do something on that scale all by yourself. And of course, everyone, you didn't even work on an altarpiece that was 5 or 6 feet wide on your own. You had apprentices. There was an entire workshop system. And Michelangelo didn't really work in that system. He didn't train up people to work with him and take over projects and then carry his name forward in the next generation. But nevertheless, he always had help. And the great Michelangelo scholar at Washington University in St. Louis, William Wallace, found the smoking gun, which tells us who these guys are who helped him. And they're all Florentines. He needed help. He had not worked in fresco since he was an adolescent. And so he needed people to help him.
There's a famous film starring Charlton Heston called The Agony and the Ecstasy, in which we see Charlton Heston on his back painting, sort of lying on the ground, painting furiously away at the ceiling. That's not how he did it. He did it standing up on a scaffolding, lifting his paintbrush up. So, of course, fresco being a very liquid medium, paint poured down all over his face and all over his hand and ran down his wrist. Anybody who's painted a ceiling, what a nightmare. Anyone who's even done it with a roller will know exactly how messy an experience it can be. But he wrote this wonderful poem.
Beard skyward, nape of neck pressed back upon my hump, I'm hollow-chested like a harpy. The brush keeps dripping till my face looks gaudy, more like a mosaic than anything you'd tread on. Somehow my loins have climbed into my gut, and as a counterweight, I use my arse. And where my feet are going, eyes don't know. In front, my hide is all stretched out and tight. Behind, my bending makes it floppy loose, and I'm as curved as any Syrian bow. No wonder that my mind is so far out of joint that it gets nothing right. This is no place for me, and I'm no painter.
In addition to his many discomforts, the months and months of painting with his head and neck bent backward caused him to develop a strange form of eye strain that plagued him throughout the years on the vault.
If you sent him a letter, he had to hold it above his head in order to read it, because the muscles in his eyes had, I'm not sure what the medical term would be, not atrophied, but they were such that his eyes could only focus if he was looking upwards, because for 3 years he had spent most of the time straining upwards with his eyes, and so he couldn't focus if he looked down or if he looked straight ahead.
The highly physical process also added to his emotional woes. During the painting of the vault, his father and his brothers would, as they always seemed to do, cause him grief and tremendous irritation.
When he was working on the Sistine Chapel, he was constantly being harassed by his younger brothers and also his father, who embezzled money from him. His younger brothers all wanted to come to Rome. And why not? Your brother is an intimate of the Pope and is working for the Pope, and as far as they were concerned, earning lots of money. And so they wanted a piece of the action, and so wanted to come to Rome and have him make introductions and get positions for them, or at least if he didn't do that, at least they could live off him. So he's quite remarkable in terms of his family, that there are so many wastrels within the family. I mean, he was very fond of some of his brothers, but they really were quite worthless, and likewise his father, it has to be said. Ludovico was I think quite work shy, and it's telling that Ludovico Buonarroti, I think, lived into the 1530s when Michelangelo was well into middle age, so he had his father for a long time. But very clearly by the early 1500s, Michelangelo was head of the family, and Ludovico was sort of shunted aside, and I think had to acknowledge that his supremely gifted son was the one who was going to call the shots within the family.
Michelangelo finally finished the tremendous labor after 4 years of hard work, numerous delays, political turmoil, personal frustrations, and family inconveniences. Even before it was finished, the ceiling had left its mark on the history of art. It became the standard by which all other artistic endeavors would be judged, and many famous figures in art history would pay homage to it in their own work. Yet for all its ambition and beauty, the work can also be seen as a portrait of Michelangelo's relationship to his own faith and beliefs.
You have to remember Michelangelo was very much an artist who didn't simply paint for the church, but painted for a church in which he believed passionately. He believed the messages of the Christian church in his time. And I think there's a strong sense in which he's painting for God. And he identifies with certain figures on the ceiling. I think he identifies with Jonah, who has to suffer so many trials. Jonah's given a great deal of prominence. He I think, hugely identifies actually with Noah. I've always felt that the ark somewhat resembles the Sistine Chapel itself in the way that Michelangelo has painted it. It looks like a building. So you think, well, is Michelangelo up on his scaffolding thinking of himself as Noah? A man who has been called to God's work in an age of decadence and corruption. Such thoughts would have been the kind of thoughts, I think, that went through Michelangelo's mind.
And this is one thing in it, the kind of secular world that we now inhabit is so easy for us to forget. Many of his works he did as acts of devotion, and many of his works were meant to be seen, like all works from the Middle Ages and Renaissance, were originally meant to be seen by candlelight on bended knee. These were in sanctified spaces, places of worship. For example, not only the Sistine Chapel, but the Pauline Chapel, where he did his frescoes years after the Sistine Chapel, again in the heart of the Vatican, in the sanctified space. He's doing these very moving images of the death of St. Peter, for example. I'm sure those images he paints of Peter, for example, upside down on the cross, he's thinking of what this martyrdom meant to him.
Upon the ceiling's completion in 1512, Michelangelo was no doubt eager to get back to sculpture. Pope Julius II died in 1513, and as a result, his tomb design would be significantly scaled down. He nonetheless carved another masterpiece in the center of the revised tomb layout, the spectacular figure of Moses seated on a throne. Between the years 1520 and 1534, he would carve 13 larger-than-life-size figures, among them the well-known sculptures Victory and the Boboli slaves. In 1536, Pope Clement VII gave him the commission to paint another enormous fresco. Known as the Last Judgment, it would be painted above the altar of none other than the Sistine Chapel. Unlike the ceiling, which portrayed the beginning of creation, this work would portray the second coming of Christ and the fulfillment of Scripture. And of course, in typical Michelangelo fashion, the work would contain over 300 figures spread over an enormous area. The artist completed it 4 years later. Though it has many characteristics of his style, the work is a much darker, less hopeful piece than the ceiling. It not only echoes the tumultuous time period in Rome's history at the time, but it shows the changing mindset and spirituality of its maker.
Michelangelo undergoes a kind of spiritual transformation, becomes a far more penitent, far less easy figure to get on with in some ways, and his art changes correspondingly. He's no longer the painter of the ideal forms that we see on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. He's a painter with a darker imagination and a painter who wants to paint. And there's another chapel next to it called the Pauline Chapel, where he created 2 remarkable paintings late in life. But the figures are lumpen. They don't have the same grace. They're full of a sense of foreboding. So catastrophe intervenes, war intervenes, time intervenes, the change of spirit and soul intervenes. So it's very moving and fascinating to see the 2 pictures, if you can call them the 2 works of art, let's call them that, because they're not single pictures really, each one is a multitude. But the Last Judgment is like comparing night with day.
By now, it was more than apparent that Michelangelo had conquered painting and sculpture and left his competition thoroughly behind. He would next master architecture. As with the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo often reminded patrons that architecture was not his profession. Yet even still, he applied the same level of ambition to architecture that he did with all other artistic media. Though his transition into architecture was not as smooth as that of his rivals Raphael and Bramante, he nonetheless left behind many impressive structures. One such commission gave him the chance to add on to the work done by his legendary predecessor and personal hero.
His greatest success as an architect, arguably, is the Laurentian Library, which is in the same complex of San Lorenzo, where he really breaks out of what we think is the Renaissance style or a classical style and develops this whole new architectural vocabulary. It's something that we don't see a lot of because of the fact that not everyone goes in there. It's not so much on the tourist trail in Florence, nor perhaps is the new sacristy that he built also in San Lorenzo. But again, it's a dramatic performance where he gets to compare himself, really lock horns with someone who I think was his hero, Filippo Brunelleschi, because Brunelleschi, of course, had done the first sacristy on the one side of San Lorenzo. Michelangelo now comes along and gets to do the other side. And so he competes with Brunelleschi and does his version of a sacristy.
Though the Laurentian Library is not as well known today, it nonetheless remains highly renowned. The staircase is a particularly stunning tour de force, with many describing it as a sculpture that happens to be a piece of architecture. Michelangelo's most famous and important architectural achievement is St. Peter's Basilica, which was given to him in 1546. Many other architects had worked on the rebuilding of St. Peter's before Michelangelo was given the project, though much of his designs are still visible, notably the church's famed dome. It was not finished until after his death, and is perhaps why it is not associated with the artist in the way Santa Maria del Fiore is with Brunelleschi. Yet upon further study, it demonstrates that Michelangelo had not only mastered architecture, but added to it.
Michelangelo, I think you could argue, was more innovative and not more important, because he's tremendously important as a painter and sculptor, but I think he was more innovative perhaps as an architect than he was as a painter or sculptor. Certainly he was an innovator in those other fields, but in architecture he really developed a language that no one else had spoken. It was, he invented architectural motifs which no one had ever seen before. And we might be used to that now when someone has and designs a new opera house or a new football stadium, because we have we can model things, you can predict the structural performance of them, etc., in ways that they couldn't back then. But you did not really get that pre-Michelangelo. You worked within established conventions and using the language of the architecture that had come before. You might say, I'm going to be more of a Romanesque architect than a Gothic architect, i.e., I'm going to look at the architecture of Europe from around 1000 or 1100 rather than 1300, 1400. However, I'm just going to recycle those motifs. But what Michelangelo did was looked at everything that had been done and said, I'm going to do something different.
Michelangelo's final years saw him still working, despite living long past the life expectancy of the times. As he aged, he became more devout in his faith, and more pensive on matters of life and death. His surviving poems reflect this thoughtful introspection as he neared the end.
You have no other way, dear Lord, to rid my soul of love, this mortal vain affection, than by some adverse chance or strange affliction, by which you set your friends free from the world. By you alone the soul is stripped and clad, purified with your precious blood, made whole, purged of all human urges, sins untold. Michelangelo, 1560. Despite his advanced age, Michelangelo never stopped creating art.
His last painting was a group of frescoes in the Vatican's Pauline Chapel, which portray the conversion of Saul and the crucifixion of St. Peter. His last sculpture became known as the Rondinini Pietà, a piece he worked on 6 days before his death, 3 weeks before his 89th birthday. He was buried in his beloved hometown of Florence in a tomb built by his longtime friend and biographer, Giorgio Vasari. Upon his death, he was widely praised as the greatest artist who ever lived, even being referred to as Il Divino, or the Divine One. Whether influencing his fellow artists like Raphael, or influencing DC and Marvel comic book artists in the modern age, his incalculable effect on art history has only grown with each successive generation. Yet at the heart of all later centuries of art history is a man who was always moving, always restless, and always seeking to outdo others, and ultimately outdo himself.
I think what's most interesting about his legacy is that he never stood still. He kept moving, he kept developing, he kept exploring new things. So you can't, when you talk about Michelangelo, you could talk about several different Michelangelos. So there's the legacy of the Sistine Chapel, there's the legacy of the Pietà, there's the legacy of the David, but there's also the legacy of his ability to rethink architecture in hugely original ways. There's the legacy of his poetry, the way in which he articulates the sense of doubt that was so central to the culture of the post-Reformation world. The doubt that you find expressed in a different way in his late sculptures, where it's almost as if he can't bear to finish a form because he feels that it would be a disrespect to God to create a figure that was complete, and he wants to remain as humble as possible. So he creates these extraordinary sculptures that he can't bear to finish, which have a different kind of beauty altogether from those which are finished. I think the not finishing of them is part of the creative process, which in itself would have a huge impact on all kinds of movements in the later history of art.
There's no one who has had the ambition to work in so many different areas, and there's certainly no one who has succeeded. Maybe some people like Leonardo da Vinci had ambitions to work in many different areas and succeeded in a couple of them, but I think no one ever reached such a high level in so many different areas. And the one that we forget because we're Anglophone is poetry. He was a great poet. He was one of the great poets of the 1500s. And these are things that use different skill sets. And so I think he sort of set the bar very high for himself in all of these different disciplines. And somehow through just the sheer force of nature that was Michelangelo, was able to carry forth and succeed at doing them, which is truly astounding when you think of everything he did in his 89 years.
Though the vast majority of us are not artistic geniuses, there is much we can learn from Michelangelo. Despite being called divine, he was far from it. His life reveals the same struggles we all face in our modern age, whether personal, physical, financial, or familial. But in spite of every trial that threatened him, he never lost sight of his ambition to do great things with the talents he had been given. In his endless drive for greatness, good enough was not an option.
Michelangelo's ambition was without equal. I'm not sure anyone has ever been quite as ambitious as he was, which was possibly part of it, with living an incredibly long time. I can't help thinking that he was determined to live a very long time so that he could realize as many of his ambitions as possible. He was very careful with his diet, he was very careful with how he dressed, and so on. He took great trouble to stay alive as long as possible so that as many of his ambitions could be realized.
The things that we can take away from his life and art are this idea of ambition, of testing the limits of human capability. What ultimately his ambition was to test what he could do, to simply be the best at whatever he could do. Whatever he did, he wanted to be the best at it, to do the best job of doing it. And so I think in our lives, we can take away that idea of whatever we're doing, whatever our Sistine Chapel is going to be, make your own Sistine Chapel and turn it into something remarkable, and which tests the limits of your capacities. The other takeaway that I think he gives us is it's not easy. I think often with great figures like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, it's easy to think that it came easy to them. They were geniuses. They could do anything. But the more you study their life, the more you look into their letters, their personal lives, their interpersonal relationships, you realize that they too had it hard. In fact, they had it harder than most of us, just in terms of the day-to-day life in the 14 and 1500s. And yet, despite the setbacks, the multiple setbacks that each of them had at virtually every point in his career, they persisted with it. And so I think it's that combination of having the great ambition and then the persistence to see it through and not to be overcome by the setbacks that you inevitably are going to encounter in the course of doing something great.
This episode of Virtuous Man was written and recorded by Scott Einig and edited by Jamie Adams. Michelangelo quotes by Larry Einig. A special thanks to Ross King and Andrew Graham-Dixon. If you enjoyed this episode, give us a rating and leave a review in the comments section. And don't forget to check out more Virtuous Men on our Instagram page at virtuous_men and give us a follow. Tune in next week for episode 4, where we discover the goodness of John Coffey.